Thank you, Arun and the ORF, for this opportunity here for a lightning round of talking. I am told that in the next 10 minutes, I'm required to talk about the potential adverse impacts of new technologies on the unified internet. It's going to be a bit of a challenge, but I'll do the best that I can. I'm going to do this by using 4 different themes. First and foremost, what unifies the internet in the first place? I want to talk about that briefly so that forms the context. And talk about standards and interoperability, which is what makes the internet behave the way it does today. Then talk about new technologies and some of the consequences that we're likely to see, intended or otherwise, we're going to see them. And finally, what is it that we, you and I and others who are interested in the upkeep of a single unified internet, what is it that we can do? Because at the end of the day, the internet is not something that somebody else does, it's something that each one of us does. So first, let me explain the role of the unique identifier systems. You know, the internet was created primarily, when it started 50 years ago, for computers to talk to each other. And to do that, there are descriptions of where messages are coming from and where they're intended to reach. So these are labels, if you will, and the way in which the labels are processed is what is called as a protocol. So there is an orderly way in which a label gets processed so that messages can go from one place to the other. These rules, if they're interpreted correctly, will allow machines to talk to each other. And that's our expectation. So if you're looking up a restaurant rating on Yelp, all you're interested in is the 4-star or the 5-star rating along with how many dollar or rupee signs it shows. You're not interested in how did your message go somewhere and come back with that information. But there's a whole bunch of rules that are being exploited in the background to make sure that you're getting the right information about the right property in the right place at the right time. For this to work, everybody has to agree to play by the same rules. You know, if you think about traffic on the roads, for instance, the reason you stay safe is because everybody agrees to drive on the same side of the road, for instance. Everybody agrees to stop when there is a red light. Everybody agrees not to overrun somebody because they're in a hurry. We take these for granted. Similarly, on the internet, there are certain rules that we embed in code into machines, and those machines, therefore, are observing and interacting with messages and enforcing these rules. To do that, you need a global system, which is what we are chartered to manage and maintain as ICANN, which is known as the Domain Name System, or DNS for short. Effectively, it's like an address book on a global basis, which contains the address of every device that is connected to the internet. And when messages are being routed from one device to the other, we make sure that these devices are operating under the overarching rules that govern the behaviors of the internet. So we coordinate these by using what are known as IP, or Internet Protocol addresses. That's a rough layman's lesson on how the internet operates with unique identifier systems. Now, our mission is to ensure that the internet remains singular, it remains interoperable, and that it is unified. In other words, that there aren't 2 or 3 or many internets, that there is one internet. And if you think about it, the internet itself is a network of networks. So what's really interesting about this is, how do we govern this? You heard earlier in the panel about multi-stakeholderism. That's the method with which we govern the internet. There is no traditional governance of the internet. In fact, it is the world's largest multi-stakeholder governance model in practice every day, where communities of self-interested volunteers from around the world get together to debate what makes for a good internet for tomorrow and the future. And that results in the evolution of protocols, which then get passed over to us to get implemented with technologies, so that, quote unquote, the rules of the road are being first encoded. Because they have now been debated and adjudicated, they come to us as an order to encode. So we encode that, and we propagate that on a global basis so that every machine that now chooses to interact with the internet as a medium is obligated to obey the rules that have been encoded. Now, we don't do this all by ourselves. We conspire with the volunteer community, and there are self-interested groups within that community, some of whom are interested in security and stability, some of whom are interested in just the way at large one of the communities works is to make sure that public interest is represented in the evolution. We have a governmental advisory committee that is interested in safety and security of its citizenry and how rules may or may not impact the safety and security of their citizens from around the world. Our governmental advisory group, as an example, has representation from 184 different countries. So the plurality of voices comes together in debating what gets cooked up as a protocol. In addition to that, from a technical viewpoint, we also work very closely with a body known as the Ietf, or the Internet Engineering Task Force, which in large measure has membership from many different vendors of many different kinds of technologies, hardware, software, networking, etc. They come together and argue about protocols and processes that will enable their equipment to interact with one another in a harmonious fashion. And that results in yet more technical standards and protocols, therefore, which also get baked into the work that we do. One specific body that will be of interest in all of this is, for short, called the SSEC, or the Security and Stability Advisory Council. They advise ICANN and ICANN's board, and I'll come to that in just a second. Let me switch to the third topic, which is the third theme, which is new technologies. So what are these new technologies that are of interest to us? We think of many. We keep track of almost anything that's happening on a global basis. But some of these are at a point of inflection in their maturity that we're keeping a very steady eye for longer periods of time on them. So these are 5G, which is now starting to sweep different parts of the world, albeit there is no standard for 5G yet. It is still being debated. There is no standard for 5G yet. IoT, Internet of Things, where tiny devices are communicating with one another, some with the internet, some not using the internet at all. Artificial intelligence, machine learning, and much more recently, quantum computing and advances in quantum computing and the impact of advances in quantum computing on how encryption is currently occurring and the impact on how it could be decrypted with advanced computing capabilities and quantum computers. Now, these new technologies will all have some impact on the internet and how the internet actually works. Now, we don't necessarily have a position about it, but we have to be interested in understanding how these impact the operations of the internet. One of the ways is to look at how these interact with the domain name system. Let me talk about a specific advisory that was issued by the Security and Stability Advisory Council very recently. On the 29th of May this year, there was a publication from the SSAC to us and our board, which talked about the DNS and the Internet of Things, opportunities, risks, and challenges. So essentially, they were looking at IoT as both an opportunity and a risk. What's the opportunity? Obvious. With IoT, you have the ability to sense a physical environment and with rules, make a logical set of post-actions occur in a much more automated fashion because you have the ability to sense the physical environment. So for instance, you could have a humidity sensor in soil in a large field where crops might be drying up because the threshold of humidity has not been met. So there could be a logical sequence of events that triggers the irrigation system to start watering that particular area so that the humidity level is increased. That's a classic example of an IoT. Now, imagine that there is a state, like the state of Uttar Pradesh in India, for example, and that the government of Uttar Pradesh says that all humidity sensors in this state shall come from this set of manufacturers. Just imagine that for a second. It's a likely thing, possible certainly. And imagine now that there needs to be an update to the software that controls this particular set of machines, IoT machines. Every one of them has to hit the DNS. Perhaps they will hit it concurrently when they have to get the next software update. Something that is good, that should happen, but the unintended consequence there is that the DNS system will be under incredible pressure, albeit for a short period of time. The shortness of time depends on the size of the download that needs to occur so that the packets are appropriately getting routed, and the number of devices that need the download to occur. If you think about these two as variable factors, it could be that for that duration of time, depending on how this gets implemented, all other services take a backseat. How important is this is a policy decision that people will be making for themselves. Unintended consequence. It's just an example of what could happen just with IoT. One challenge to make the DNS and its security functions available as a result of this on popular IoT operating systems is to develop something that interacts with every variant of an operating system that could be making these IoT devices work. Imagine an IoT device that needs to be intelligent enough to do an automated download. It needs to have the ability to have software that has that intelligence built into it. That presumes that it has memory. That means that there is a management function required. It means that there is a timing mechanism involved. There's a whole plethora of impacts that are involved when you start making IoT more intelligent, which now says that there has to be security, or else there could be malfeasance, deliberately or otherwise. That's a tax. And if that tax has to work with the infrastructure of the current DNS, it may or may not work as we've currently devised it. We may need to make extensions to the DNS happen just so that IoT remains safe in a world that's adopting IoT at a really fast pace. DNS Sec is a security standard that has been rolled out to make sure that the DNS is secure at that level, in that layer. It could be, if there are many different IoT operating systems, the heterogeneity that comes with that has to be accommodated in DNS Sec, which is a protocol today that looks for a few variants, not infinite variations. That's a challenge, that's an unintended consequence. So while we would support IoT, we have no right to stop it, as a matter of fact. We also have to think about the stress that it places on that global common infrastructure called the DNS. When I talk about IoT, oftentimes the DNS engineers that I talk to don't understand what it means. When I talk about the DNS and the audience is IoT professionals, they have no idea what I'm talking about. So it's not just policy people talking to technologists that talk past each other, it's technologists talking past one another, because it's subdomains of expertise where there is complete lack of knowledge, leave alone appreciation for the impact of one with the other. These are real-world problems that we're headed toward, and we're doing that at an alarmingly fast pace, by the way. If you're interested in what I'm talking about, I encourage you to look at the SSAC reports. They're available on our website. If you go to ICANN.org and look for the SSAC 105, you'll find this to be a fascinating paper on just the interaction between the DNS and IoT devices with all the challenges and opportunities. So what can we do about it? What can this room full of people do about it? We're concerned. If we weren't concerned, we wouldn't be here. One of the things that comes with this concern is an obligation to understand and act. And I'm going to be asking you to think about what you can do with the hope that you will act upon whatever it is that you can do about it. The internet by nature knows no boundaries. We know that. It's extending more and more. It's not shrinking anytime soon. There is no one person who controls the internet. There is no one entity that controls the internet. There is no one body of people. We all control the internet because the internet is a network of networks. You control your network, I control my network, and we build upon one another's networks to make them talk to each other, and therefore that's the internet that we do between us, and so on and so forth. So this is a distributed yet collective system with norms. Like the internet, which is built on open and distributed architectures, the governance systems are also built on open architectures. Multi-stakeholderism is that openness of architecture in practice to come up with how and what protocols can and should make a difference. We, as a community of interested people, have to continue to come together asking for expert opinion to weigh in on topics that will have an impact on the internet of the future, to understand better what that impact will be before we come up with the next set of protocols. Because at the end of the day, given the spread of the internet and the speed of its spread, it is automated protocols and only those that will enable us to continue to operate the internet as we now know of it. So while there is the threat of the splinternet, we should not take it for granted that the internet is meant to be splintered. On the contrary, with the knowledge and the interest of the people here and the expertise of deep experts in different areas of evolution today, we have an obligation to understand what the impacts are likely to be, explore that deliberately and thoughtfully, and take appropriate measures so that as a common community of interested people, we evolve the protocols and standards that will help us to continue to make this internet interoperate as a singular body, and not let these forces be the reason why the internet splinters. So that's a deliberate call to action. It means that you have to ask yourself, how can I take what Ashwin just said and make it my own? What forum do I have access to that will help me to contribute? It could be that you're an expert and can weigh in with your expertise on how a specific new technology could impact the internet, and then get engaged in the policy-making process so that the resulting protocol is actually capable of withstanding the pressure of the new technology. If we don't do that, we have the certainty of splintering the internet. But if, on the contrary, we take a conscious effort to step in and do what we're required to, there is every reason to believe that only other non-technology forces will be responsible for splintering the internet. It'll ensure that technology is not the reason why the internet will become more than one. We can make sure that it stays singular, it's interoperable, and it's whole. So please, rise up to the challenge. We will do our part. I ask that each of you do your part as well. And thank you again for giving me the opportunity.